Hey everyone, Eric Olander here, managing editor of the China Africa Project newsletter, website, and podcast. Today we're going to be talking about China Africa 101. A lot of you may now be assigned stories to cover the Chinese in Africa, and you may be a little bit intimidated by the subject as it is a very new subject for some people and can be potentially confusing. So I thought instead of me telling you about all the basics of China, Africa, and Chinese engagement in Africa, I'm going to bring back somebody who I've had on my podcast a number of times and who I'm a big fan. And she literally, and I'm not joking, she literally wrote the book on China Africa 101. This is the complete beginner's guide to China Africa relations. Lina Getachew Ayenew, who is native from Ethiopia, lives in Beijing, but joins us today from the United States. A very good morning to you, Lina.
Good morning to you, Eric.
Well, it's great to have you, and you are absolutely the best person to talk to us about China Africa 101 and to kind of talk to journalists a little bit about in Africa who are covering this story now. It's a story that people really can't get away from because the Chinese engagement in Africa touches so many aspects of society, from technology to politics to debt to race to culture, to so many different ways. So let's just kind of, step back a little bit from the present. A lot of people think that the Chinese presence in Africa is something that's new. In your book, you talk about the fact that, well, it actually is new, but kind of not. Tell us a little bit about the history of the Chinese in Africa.
So the history goes back to the Ming Dynasty, of course, and Zheng He, who was a Ming Dynasty explorer, actually sailed to the Swahili coast of Africa, and that's where basically one of the major contacts between China and Africa have happened. And we also have a couple of travelers who have journeyed to China. And right now, of course, we feel like the China Africa story really started in the 2000s, but actually a lot of engagement was happening also in the 20th century, in the 60s and the 70s, with the building of the Tazara Railway, with the anti-colonial struggle, and also with in the United Nations and with African countries essentially voting for China to join the UN. And so the engagement has been happening for a long time, but I think we're paying more and more attention now. And of course, the engagement became more intimate in the last 20 or so years. What I think a lot of people also should focus on is that the involvement of China in the last 20 years started really becoming more and more detailed in almost every sector, in every major sector in Africa. So in the last 20 years, I think it can be argued that we have our relationship with Africa, with the China, became a lot more intense. Would you agree? Would you
So,
agree?
yeah, and it's very confusing, I think, for people to follow whether the China Africa story is a good story for Africa or it's a bad story. So, when you look at the news, and this is in Ethiopia, in Kenya, all across the continent, you will see a
Mm-hmm.
lot of coverage that says China's colonizing Africa, China is taking over Africa. This is really a neo-imperialism. You'll hear these very strong negative stories that China is really the worst thing that's happened to Africa. You'll see a lot of that coverage. Some of that comes from the US and Europe and whatnot. At the same
Yes.
time, then you'll turn on some of the Chinese media, CGTN, Xinhua, China Radio, and even some of the African state media, and you'll see the opposite. China is the best thing that's ever happened to Africa. China's brought jobs, it's brought infrastructure, it's brought development, it's done a lot of things. It's
Right.
82,000, I think that's the number right now, of African students, a number from Ethiopia, are studying in China today. That's a huge thing. So somebody
Mhm.
who has followed the news for so many years about the China Africa story, help a journalist to understand what it's like. Is it this, which extreme is it? Is it good or is it bad?
I think that premise itself, like good or bad, I think hides a lot of the shades in the middle. And that's where I think most of the story is happening. Because, if China was all terrible and if everything that China did was horrendous, I think that our engagement with China will not be what it is today. On the other hand, there are a lot of problems. I think that cannot be denied. There are a lot of issues, regarding things like the environment, for example, and those things are 100% true as well. So I think trying to simplify the relationship between China and Africa as all good or all bad actually is is not worthy of reporting today, to be honest. I think that the details, those things are what people want to hear, because we all heard, there are people who are pro-China, there are people who are not, there are people who think that, oh, it's a net positive. Yeah, there are bad things, there are good things, but the good outweigh the bad. There are net negative people who are like, there are good things and there are bad things, but the bad outweighs the good. But a lot of the stories, a lot of the interesting things are happening right in the middle. And I think that is where our focus should be. And especially because, I obviously, because I'm Ethiopian, I have a personal stake in the well being of Africa. And for me, I think a lot of the reporting that we get has to be so that we make good decisions for ourselves and our people. And I think those decisions are only made by reporting that really gets to the details and the nuance and a particular situation, you know what I mean, as opposed to like, everything is terrible, it's the end of the world, or this is so rosy and this is the best thing that ever happened to us. And that's where I stand, but I also understand that the simplicity of making generalizations, if you only have 3 or 4 paragraphs for a particular story, it is easy to to simplify things for the reader. And I also understand that a lot of our communication, the communication between Africans and China, has always happened through a Western or like a European or an American intermediary, because there's the language and cultural barrier, and we get a lot of the news about what's happening in China from news outlets that are actually based outside of China. And because of that rerouting of information, not only do a lot of things get blurred, but also we see sides, different sides that may or may not highlight the issues that we are facing on the ground. So I think the importance of trying to highlight the nuances of a particular story, and also understand that things are always more complicated than they are, I think is a good place to start.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because one of the things that I like to say is that if you read a news story that's all bad about the Chinese in Africa, I tend to think that you're missing about 50% of the story. Conversely, if you read a news story that says everything is rosy, everything is great, you're also missing about 50% of the story. This is a kind of story where the good and the bad sit side by side with one another, and they're very close to one another. And so it's easy to see whatever you want in this relationship. You can, if you want to see only the bad, it's easy to find the bad. If you want to see only the good, it's all there. But when we're reporting the story, it's our job as reporters to be able to bring all of that together and to make that beautiful complexity that sometimes leaves people more confused, but at the end of the day is probably more accurate. A couple months, actually it was last year, wow, time goes by fast. You and I were together in Shanghai, and we did a myth-busting event where we brought like 10 myths out. And these myths are still very, very popular today in a lot of African media coverage about the Chinese. So we hear a lot about imported labor. So the Chinese have tons and tons of labor all across Africa. We hear a lot about obviously debt and now the debt trap that the Chinese are going to take up assets from the port of
Right.
Mombasa to trains in Nigeria to all of these different things. What advice would you have for reporters who are covering this story and they come across these types of myths that people are convinced are true, but not
Right.
necessarily backed up by fact? What advice would you have for them?
I would say the first place to probably go is the people who actually made their life's work to research this, and we have excellent researchers in the field, and I think the field is growing. There are people who, academics and others who have been really getting into the nitty gritty of this, looking at documents over years and years, decades sometimes, analyzing the numbers, crunching the data. And of course, it's an ocean. I always say, like, there is no China Africa expert really because it's just so huge as a field. But, given how complex it is, there are people who are attempting to understand the whole picture. So I think the first place to go is to those people and understand their research. And I do not want to discount the sentiments of the public or the sentiments of people. I think that some of the negative feelings are rooted in, sometimes in events that happened, or in the general impression that the people get. And I do not want to discount that because that itself is a part of the story.
Right.
But at the same time, I think it's important to also mention facts at the very least, so that readers know that someone who has made their job to study this has come to this conclusion. I think that's a good place to start. But as a reporter, I think it's also good to mention that, like, there is a sentiment within the public, whether it's rooted in facts or data or not. It's still an interesting information for someone to know that the people is think this way. So I think facts and also touching upon why people seem to think the way they do will create a more well-rounded story, in my opinion.
Yeah. And again, public opinion in Africa is very, very split based on language, based on geography,